My name is Michelle, and I am 33 years old. I stood on the porch of the four-bedroom house I had just bought with my own life savings, holding my new keys when my mother looked me dead in the eye and demanded to know why I had stolen my sister's master suite. I had no idea that my refusal to hand over a spare key would lead to an attempted forced move-in, a 6-month eviction record, and a $150,000 secret that would completely destroy my parents at my grandmother's 82nd birthday dinner. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to set a hard boundary with a toxic family member. The air that Tuesday morning was crisp and carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass. I stood on the front porch of a beautiful brick colonial in one of the most coveted suburban neighborhoods in the city. After a decade of working grueling 70-hour weeks as a senior supply chain director, climbing the corporate ladder step by difficult step, I had finally achieved my dream. The keys in my hand felt heavy with the weight of my accomplishments. I slid the brass key into the deadbolt, feeling a profound sense of peace. This was mine. Every brick, every window, every blade of grass had been paid for by my own sheer determination. I pushed the heavy wooden door open, inhaling the smell of fresh paint and polished hardwood floors. I had not even crossed the threshold when the screech of tires on pavement shattered the quiet morning. I turned around to see a silver luxury SUV whip into my driveway, parking at a sharp angle that crushed the edge of my new flower beds. I recognized the vehicle immediately. It belonged to my parents, Richard and Patricia. For a brief, naive second, I thought they had come to surprise me with congratulations. I had casually mentioned my closing date to my father the week before, hoping for a sliver of parental pride. But as my mother slammed her car door and marched up the brick walkway, her face was not arranged in a smile of celebration. Her features were twisted into a mask of sheer rage, her eyes narrowed and her jaw set. My father followed closely behind her, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable. I stepped back onto the porch, my defensive instincts automatically flaring to life. Patricia did not offer a greeting. She did not ask how I was doing. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, and delivered a blow that temporarily robbed me of my breath. "How dare you close on a 4-bedroom house without consulting us first?" she yelled, her voice echoing loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. "We already promised Brittany and Kevin the master suite, and the 2 guest rooms are for their kids." I stood frozen, staring down at the woman who had brought me into this world. The words hung in the empty space between us, so completely detached from reality that my brain struggled to process them. My 30-year-old sister Brittany and her husband Kevin were supposedly moving into the home I had just spent my entire life savings to purchase. According to my mother, the master suite was already spoken for. The sheer audacity of her statement hit me like a force. In any normal family, buying a first home would have brought congratulations photographs and perhaps a bottle of champagne. In mine, achievement was treated as inventory to be reassigned. Brittany had always occupied the protected center of our family, while I was expected to solve problems quietly and accept whatever remained. My parents did not see 4 bedrooms purchased through my discipline. They saw unused capacity that their favored daughter could claim. That old pattern flashed through my mind, but I refused to let it drag me into a history lesson on the porch. The immediate facts were enough. I had worked grueling weeks, saved the down payment qualified for the mortgage, and signed the deed alone. Neither Richard nor Patricia had contributed a dollar or asked permission before promising away rooms they had never entered. Their confidence told me they expected my obedience, not my agreement. I tightened my grip on the keys and reminded myself that being related to someone did not give them ownership of my labor. I gripped the house keys tighter, feeling the sharp metal bite into my palm. The familiar sting of being the family's scapegoat flared in my chest, but I was no longer the desperate teenager begging for their approval. I was a grown woman who managed complex global logistics for a living. I handled high-pressure negotiations daily. I was not going to let them bully me on my own front porch. "I am sorry," I said, my voice dangerously calm and completely level. "Who promised my master suite to Brittany?" "We did," my father interjected, stepping up beside my mother. His tone carried that authoritative weight he always used to end arguments. "You are a single woman, Michelle. You have absolutely no need for 4 bedrooms and a large backyard. Your sister has a growing family. They need the space to save money for a few years, and it is your duty to help them. You should have consulted us before finalizing the floor plan so we could make sure the layout worked for the children." I looked at my father, really looked at him, and realized the depth of their entitlement. They truly believed that my financial success belonged to the family collective, specifically to benefit their favorite child. They had mentally moved my sister into my home without ever once asking me, assuming I would just quietly accept my role as the supportive background character in Brittany's life. "You are out of your minds," I said, maintaining my composed exterior, while a furious fire burned inside me. "This is my home. I paid the down payment. I secured the mortgage. My name is the only one on the deed. I am not operating a charity boarding house for my adult sister and her husband." Patricia gasped dramatically, clutching her chest as if I had physically struck her. "Listen to yourself," she shrieked. "You are acting like a selfish spinster, hoarding space you do not even need. We are a family. We share our blessings. Brittany needs a safe place to raise her children, and you are going to deny your own blood just so you can have empty rooms gathering dust?" "Brittany and Kevin both have full-time jobs," I replied, refusing to match her escalating volume. "Their housing situation is their responsibility, not mine. If they need a 4-bedroom house, they can save up and buy one exactly like I did." My father stepped onto the first step of the porch, closing the distance between us. His face hardened, shedding any pretense of paternal warmth. "We are not asking for your permission, Michelle," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing pitch. "We are telling you how this is going to work. Family decisions are made collectively. Hand over a spare key right now so we can bring Kevin over to measure the rooms for the children's furniture." The demand hung in the cool morning air. I looked at the outstretched hand of my father, a man who had never once offered me financial help, demanding the key to my greatest achievement so he could hand it over to his preferred daughter. Years of suppressed exhaustion of constantly proving my worth, of being treated as nothing more than a convenient utility, suddenly vanished. In its place was an absolute unbreakable resolve. I did not cry. I did not yell. I simply took a step backward across the threshold of my new home. I looked my father dead in the eye, holding his gaze with a coldness that finally made him flinch. "You will never have a key to this house," I said with absolute finality. "And if you or Brittany step foot on this property without my permission, I will have you removed for trespassing." Before either of them could formulate another command, I stepped fully across the threshold and pulled the heavy wooden door shut. The solid thud cut Patricia off in the middle of a sentence. I turned the deadbolt until it clicked into place, then kept my hand on the lock for one steady breath. Through the narrow glass beside the frame, I saw my father's face harden and my mother raise both fists toward the wood. They had expected the doorway to remain open long enough for pressure guilt and repetition to wear me down. Instead, there was now a locked barrier between their entitlement and the home I had earned. I looked once at the keys in my palm, then walked deeper into the empty foyer as their muffled outrage began outside. The solid oak door muffled their voices. I stood in the foyer listening as my mother began pounding her fists against the frame. Her sharp voice echoed the toxic entitlement defining my childhood. "Open this door right now!" she shrieked, her fist striking the wood in an angry rhythm. You are acting like a selfish spinster, hoarding space you do not even need. The phrase was a deliberate attempt to weaponize my single status against me. I closed my eyes, refusing to let the familiar sting take root. This was how Patricia always operated. Whenever she wanted something for her favorite daughter, she resorted to tearing me down. Through the heavy door, she continued her tirade, demanding that I stop being difficult and let them inside to measure the rooms for Brittany. Hearing her scream about my 30-year-old sister brought a bitter smile to my face. Brittany was the undisputed golden child of the family, a status she had enjoyed since birth. When Brittany wanted to spend 2 years finding herself after dropping out of college, my parents happily funded her backpacking trips across Europe, paying for her hostels, meals, and endless souvenirs. Yet on the exact day I turned 18, Patricia handed me a formal rental agreement. She informed me staying in my childhood bedroom would now cost $600 a month, so I could learn the value of hard work. I worked double shifts at a grocery store just to afford the roof over my head. That glaring double standard had shaped my entire worldview. It taught me that I could only rely on myself, while Brittany learned she could rely on everyone else. Now my mother was standing on my front porch, demanding that I surrender the ultimate symbol of my hard-earned independence just to make Brittany's life a little more comfortable. Suddenly, the brass flap of the mail slot snapped open. I looked down to see my father's eyes peering through the narrow opening. His voice boomed into my brand-new foyer with practiced authority. "Michelle," he barked, his tone thick with condescension. "You owe this to the family. Brittany just needs to save money for a few years so they can get back on their feet. It is a temporary arrangement. You have the space and she has the children. Keeping this massive house all to yourself is a disgusting insult to our core family values." I stared at the mail slot, amazed by the sheer manipulation. Save money for a few years. I knew exactly what that meant in my family. A few years would turn into a decade. Brittany and Kevin would take over the master suite, their children would take over the guest rooms, and I would be relegated to the role of a live-in maid and financial provider in my own home. My father continued his gaslighting campaign. "You are being completely unreasonable," he insisted, his voice echoing off the freshly painted walls. "We are trying to keep this family together. Your sister is struggling, and you are parading your wealth around by buying a house that is far too big for one person. You should be ashamed of your greed. Open this door right now so we can sit down like adults and figure out the logistics of the move." I felt a surge of adrenaline that used to make me cave to their demands. In the past, that accusation would have sent me spiraling into guilt. I would have opened the door, apologized for upsetting them, and tried to find a compromise that inevitably left me drained and exhausted. But I was no longer that girl. I was a senior supply chain director who managed multi-million-dollar contracts. I simply did not negotiate with emotional terrorists anymore. I bent down slowly, directly meeting my father's angry gaze. "I do not owe you, Brittany, or anyone else, a single square foot of this property," I said quietly, making sure every word was perfectly enunciated. "My family values involve paying for my own life, not stealing from others. Take your car and leave my driveway immediately. I am completely finished having this conversation with you." I snapped the mail slot shut, cutting off his sputtering response. I did not wait to hear what he would yell next. Instead of engaging in a screaming match, I turned my back and walked away. I headed straight into the spacious, sunlit kitchen that I had fallen in love with during the open house. The room was filled with cardboard boxes waiting to be unpacked. I reached into my bag, pulled out my noise-canceling headphones, and slipped them over my ears. I pressed play on a calm playlist, instantly replacing the muffled sounds of my parents' rage with soothing piano notes. I grabbed a box cutter and sliced open a box labeled kitchenware. I carefully unpacked my plates, arranging them perfectly in the cabinets. I wiped down the pristine quartz countertops and organized my coffee station. I spent the next 2 hours completely immersed in the joy of making this house my own. Occasionally, I felt a faint vibration through the floorboards from my parents pounding on the door. But I remained entirely unfazed. I did not check the window. I did not look at my phone. I simply existed in my peace, refusing to let their temper tantrum taint my first day in my new home. By the time I took off my headphones, the house was completely silent. They had finally given up and left. The rest of the day actually passed by wonderfully. I ordered takeout, took a long shower, and slept deeply in a bed that belonged to no one but me. When I woke up the next morning, the confrontation on the porch felt like a distant, unpleasant memory. I genuinely thought the worst was over. I assumed my strict boundary had finally gotten through to them. I went down to my pristine kitchen, the morning sun streaming through the large bay windows, and brewed a fresh pot of coffee. I poured the coffee and leaned against the counter, taking a deep breath. The neighborhood was beautifully quiet, the perfect picture of suburban tranquility that I had worked so hard to secure for myself. Then, very suddenly, a low mechanical rumble broke the silence. A heavy diesel engine groaned as it shifted gears. I frowned, holding my coffee mug, and walked into the living room to look out the large front window. The sight that met my eyes made my blood run cold. A massive commercial moving truck was now backing slowly into my driveway. It was moving too fast, misjudging the angle. I watched in absolute horror as the giant dual tires rolled right off the pavement and sank deep into my freshly manicured front lawn. A loud crack echoed through the air as the heavy truck crushed my brand-new sprinkler system, snapping the plastic pipes and sending a geyser of water shooting into the air. The truck finally ground to a halt, idling loudly as dark exhaust fumes drifted past. The driver's side door swung open, and my brother-in-law Kevin hopped out of the cab, casually wiping sweat from his forehead, as if he had every right in the world to park a moving van on my crushed grass. I stared through the glass of my front window, struggling to process the sheer audacity unfolding directly on my freshly manicured lawn. The heavy, brutal treads of the commercial moving truck had carved incredibly deep, muddy trenches into the bright green turf I had admired just 24 hours ago. Water from a shattered sprinkler head was bubbling up continuously, creating a dirty, rapidly expanding puddle around the massive tires. Kevin slammed the driver's side door shut. He stretched his arms over his head, letting out a loud groan, and began walking toward my door. I felt a surge of hot, undeniable anger rise in my chest. I set my coffee mug down hard on the windowsill. I turned away from the window, marched straight across the foyer, and unlocked the heavy front door. The morning air was crisp, but I felt completely flushed with a rising, fiery fury as I stepped out onto the wide porch. Before I could even say a word to Kevin, the passenger side door of the truck swung open. My sister Brittany climbed down, her movements exaggerated and theatrical. She was holding her 3-year-old daughter Emma on her hip while dragging her 5-year-old son Leo tightly by his hand. Brittany looked perfectly put together, wearing designer athletic wear and oversized sunglasses. She did not look embarrassed or ashamed. In fact, she wore a bright, beaming smile that made my stomach turn over. She walked very confidently up the long driveway, carefully avoiding the muddy trenches the truck had just created, and stopped at the base of my porch steps. She looked up at me, completely ignoring the intense confrontation that had taken place with our parents the day before. It was a classic, predictable move in my family dynamic. If they just pretended the boundary did not exist, they wholeheartedly believed I would eventually fold under the crushing, relentless pressure of social expectation and familial duty. Brittany nudged her son forward, her voice dripping with artificial, sugary sweetness. "Go give Auntie Michelle a big hug," she instructed loudly. "Go on, Leo. Tell her thank you so much for your big new bedrooms." My heart broke slightly as I looked down at my nephew. Leo looked completely confused, and visibly tired, clutching a small stuffed bear tightly to his chest. Emma buried her face in her mother's shoulder, overwhelmed by the sudden change in environment. Brittany was weaponizing her own children, using their innocence as an emotional battering ram against my strict boundaries. She knew I loved my niece and nephew. She was banking on the fact that I would never turn away two small children standing on my doorstep. It was a calculated, predatory move designed to trigger my guilt and force my immediate compliance. I did not bend down to hug Leo. I kept my posture rigid and my expression completely neutral, refusing to participate in her manufactured family moment. Brittany's smile faltered slightly when I did not react, but she quickly recovered, shifting her weight and adopting a tone of helpless, desperate distress. "Michelle, we are in a really tight spot right now," Brittany said, her voice dropping into a practiced, pitiful whine. "Our apartment lease officially expired this morning at 8. We had to be completely moved out, or the landlord was going to charge us a penalty fee we cannot afford. We literally have nowhere else to go. If you do not let us in right now, you are effectively throwing your own niece and nephew out onto the street. We do not have money for a hotel room. We need to start moving the heavy furniture into the guest rooms today, so the kids have a safe place to sleep tonight. You cannot just leave us standing out here. It is incredibly selfish and not fair to the children." I listened to her dramatic speech, analyzing every single word. The manipulation was layered so thickly, it was almost suffocating. She was attempting to make me entirely responsible for her housing crisis. She and Kevin were both in their 30s. They both had steady jobs and had known for many months that their lease was ending. Yet they had deliberately chosen not to secure a new place to live, relying entirely on the ridiculous promise my parents made that they could simply commandeer my home. They had driven a moving truck onto my property without a single conversation with me, assuming my lifelong conditioning as the family scapegoat would magically override my legal rights as a homeowner. I looked at Brittany, then at Kevin, who was standing a few feet away with his hands stuffed lazily into his pockets, looking expectantly at the front door, as if waiting for a bellhop. I took a deliberate step back on the porch and crossed my arms firmly over my chest. I felt a profound, empowering sense of clarity. The fear and obligation that had controlled me for 3 decades were completely gone. "Brittany, your housing situation is not my responsibility," I said, keeping my voice loud enough for Kevin to hear, but completely devoid of any emotional fluctuation. "Your poor planning does not constitute an emergency on my part. I told Mom and Dad yesterday that you are not moving into this house under any circumstances. That was not a simple negotiation or a debate. I am not letting you inside, and I am not giving you a key. You have exactly 5 minutes to get that truck off my grass and out of my driveway before I take further action." Brittany gasped loudly, her sunglasses slipping down her nose. Her eyes went wide with genuine, unadulterated shock. For her entire life, a few tears and a victim narrative had been the golden ticket to getting her way. She had never faced a hard no that actually held firm. "You cannot be serious," she stammered, her voice rising in frantic panic. "We are family. You have 4 bedrooms. You are being completely heartless. Where are we supposed to go?" "That is a problem for you and Kevin to solve today," I replied coldly, completely unwavering in my stance. "My 5-minute timer starts right now." Before Brittany could unleash the screaming fit I saw brewing in her eyes, another vehicle turned aggressively onto my quiet suburban street. A familiar silver luxury SUV pulled up right behind the moving truck, parking illegally on the street corner. My parents had arrived to supervise the move and ensure their grand plan was executed smoothly without any further delays. Patricia threw her car door open and marched across the lawn, her expensive heels sinking deep into the soft, muddy dirt. Richard followed close behind her, his face bright red with boiling anger and indignation. Patricia did not even bother to look at Brittany or the frightened children standing on the walkway. She marched straight up the wooden porch steps, her eyes locked fiercely onto me with absolute venomous intent. "Stop throwing a childish tantrum, Michelle," my mother barked, treating me exactly like a disobedient toddler throwing a fit. "We are doing this as a family today, and you are going to cooperate whether you like it or not." She did not stop at the top of the stairs. She lunged forward aggressively, throwing her entire body weight against me in a desperate physical attempt to shove me completely out of the way and violently force her way right through my front door. I stumbled backward as my mother collided with me, the sudden impact knocking the breath from my lungs. My shoulder blades hit the heavy wooden doorframe hard, but I planted my feet firmly on the welcome mat, refusing to yield another inch of my property. Patricia clawed frantically at the door handle behind me, her manicured fingers scratching against the brass lock as she tried to force her way inside. The sheer physical aggression of her assault crossed a line that our family had never breached before. The verbal manipulation and financial demands were terrible, but this physical violation of my space shattered any remaining illusion that these people deserved my respect. I shoved her back with a swift defensive motion, using enough force to create a solid barrier of space between us. Patricia stumbled down the top step, catching her balance on the wooden railing. Her face twisted into an expression of profound shock, as if she could not fathom that the daughter she had always controlled was finally fighting back. My father stepped forward, raising his hands and shouting at me to show some respect to my mother. I ignored him completely. I reached into the back pocket of my jeans and pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline surging through my veins, but my mind was completely clear. I unlocked the screen, dialed 911, and pressed the phone to my ear. "Put that phone away right now!" Richard demanded, his voice dropping into a harsh warning growl. "You are not calling anyone. We are your family. We are settling this privately today." I held up a single finger, silencing him as the dispatcher answered the line. "Yes, I need immediate police assistance at my residence," I said, making sure my voice carried clearly across the lawn so Brittany and Kevin could hear every single syllable. "I have 5 individuals trespassing on my private property. One of them just physically assaulted me and attempted to force entry into my home. No, they are refusing to leave. I need an officer here right away." I provided my address, speaking with the calm, measured precision I use during high-stakes corporate negotiations. Patricia let out a loud, mocking laugh, glancing back at Brittany, who was still standing by the moving truck. "She is bluffing," my mother sneered, waving her hand dismissively. "She would never call the police on her own flesh and blood. She is just trying to cause a scene to get attention. Get those boxes out of the truck, Kevin. We are moving in today." Kevin looked hesitant, glancing nervously down the quiet suburban street, but a sharp look from Brittany spurred him into action. He walked to the back of the moving truck, rolled up the heavy metal door, and began pulling down a stack of cardboard boxes. He carried them across my crushed lawn and dropped them onto the bottom of the porch steps. I stood my ground, leaning against my locked front door, watching them act out their delusion. I did not say another word. I did not need to. The trap had been set, and they were walking willingly right into it. The neighborhood I had chosen for my new home was incredibly peaceful and highly affluent. It was the kind of place where lawns were perfectly manicured, neighbors knew each other by name, and any disruption to the social order was immediately noticed. As Kevin carried the 3rd stack of boxes to my porch, the front door of the house across the street slowly opened. An older woman stepped out onto her porch, holding a watering can, watching the unfolding chaos with wide, curious eyes. 2 houses down, a man paused his lawnmower, staring openly at the massive commercial truck parked illegally on my grass. My parents were incredibly image-conscious people. They cared about their social standing more than anything else in the world. Their entire identity was wrapped up in projecting the illusion of upper-middle-class perfection. As the neighbors began to watch, I saw the first cracks of genuine panic appear on my father's face. He glanced nervously at the surrounding houses, suddenly realizing that this private family bullying session was turning into a very public spectacle. Less than 5 minutes later, the distant wail of a siren pierced the quiet morning air. The sound grew rapidly louder, echoing off the brick facades of the surrounding homes. A local patrol car turned sharply onto my street, its red and blue lights flashing brilliantly against the morning sun. The police cruiser pulled up directly behind my parents' luxury vehicle, effectively blocking them from leaving. Two uniformed officers stepped out, adjusting their duty belts and assessing the bizarre scene of the crushed sprinklers, the moving truck, and the angry family members standing on my lawn. The transformation in my parents was instant and sickening to watch. Patricia immediately smoothed her hair, plastered a warm, welcoming smile onto her face, and walked down the porch steps to greet the officers. Richard quickly followed, adjusting his collar and adopting his most charming, agreeable posture. "Good morning, officers," my father said, extending his hand as if he were greeting a colleague at the country club. "There is no emergency here. I apologize if we wasted your time. This is just a simple family misunderstanding. My daughter just bought this beautiful home, and we are helping her sister move in today. Emotions are just running a little high because moving is so stressful." The older officer, a tall man with a stern, no-nonsense expression, bypassed my father's outstretched hand entirely. He looked past my parents and focused his attention directly on me. I was the one standing defensively against the door, my arms crossed, breathing heavily from the physical altercation. "Are you the homeowner, ma'am?" the officer asked clearly. "Yes, officer," I replied, projecting my voice so the entire neighborhood could hear. "I am the sole owner of this property. I did not invite these people here. I explicitly told them yesterday that they were not permitted to move in. Today, they drove a commercial truck onto my lawn, destroying my sprinklers, and my mother physically shoved me in an attempt to break into my house. I want them removed from my property immediately." Patricia gasped, her hand flying to her chest in a practiced display of maternal shock. "Michelle, how can you lie like that to the police? We are a loving family. We are just trying to help your sister." The officer held up his hand, instantly cutting off her theatrical performance. "Ma'am, save it now," he said firmly. He turned and looked directly at my father. "Sir, this is private property. You can pack those boxes up and vacate right now, or I will write citations for trespassing and property damage." The humiliation on my father's face was absolute perfection. He glared at me with immense hatred. He knew there was absolutely no way to talk his way out of this. "Pack it up," Kevin Richard muttered, with suppressed fury. "We are leaving." As Patricia finally got into her car, she rolled down the window, her face extremely pale. "You just declared war on this family. Wait until Grandma Beatrice hears you put toddlers on the street." She quickly rolled the passenger window up. Seconds later, my phone buzzed with a notification. I had just been added to a massive extended family group chat. The notification banner slid into view. The new thread read, "Family Intervention." Before I could process the sheer audacity, the unread message counter began to tick upward rapidly. 5 messages, 10, 20. I took a deep breath and tapped the glass screen to open the chat. The digital war had officially begun. The group chat was populated by dozens of extended family members. Aunts, uncles, and cousins I had not spoken to in years were all suddenly invested in my personal life. My mother had clearly spent the car ride home spinning a masterful, detailed narrative to assassinate my character. According to Patricia, I was a wealthy, heartless corporate elitist who had purchased a massive house simply to gloat. She painted a horrifying picture of me standing on my porch, laughing cruelly as I threw my struggling sister and two innocent toddlers out onto the cold streets. The responses from my extended family were swift and vicious. These were the flying monkeys, eager to do my parents' bidding without ever bothering to ask for my side of the story. Aunt Barbara, who had not called me in a decade, typed a furious paragraph accusing me of having a rotten, spoiled heart. Cousin Greg, who still owed me $500, chimed in to say my corporate salary had clearly made me lose touch with basic human decency. The messages flowed like a toxic river across my screen. They called me selfish, they called me cruel, they demanded that I apologize immediately and hand over the keys. I set the phone down. I did not reply. I knew from bitter experience that arguing with manipulators only gives them more ammunition. The more you try to explain logic to an angry mob, the faster they twist your words to fit their narrative. Instead of engaging with the chat, I opened my social media applications. My news feed was suddenly clogged with passive-aggressive posts. Aunt Martha had shared an overly stylized graphic about how family loyalty is the only thing that matters in life. She tagged my mother in the comments with praying hands emojis. Another cousin posted a lengthy status about how money changes people. It was an orchestrated attack designed to isolate me and crush my spirit through intense social pressure. As I read through the nasty comments, a profound realization washed over me. This was not a new tactic. My parents had always controlled the family narrative. They spent my entire life crafting the story that Brittany was a fragile angel who needed protection, while I was simply difficult and ungrateful. A specific memory surfaced, sharp and incredibly painful. I remembered standing backstage at my high school graduation. I was the valedictorian of my class. I had spent 4 years studying late into the night, sacrificing weekends to maintain a perfect grade point average. I was wearing my gold sash, clutching my carefully written speech, and scanning the massive auditorium for my parents. I looked at the row where they were supposed to be sitting. The seats were completely empty. They had skipped my valedictorian speech entirely. When I finally reached them on the phone, hours later, Patricia acted as if I was being unreasonable. Brittany had a minor junior varsity cheerleading competition that afternoon, and my mother insisted Brittany needed emotional support because she was nervous. My father had backed her up, telling me I was smart enough to handle a speech on my own, while my sister needed them much more. They later told the extended family that I had demanded they leave because I was too nervous to speak, completely rewriting history to make me look like a difficult teenager. Now standing in my beautiful new kitchen, I saw the exact same pattern playing out. They were twisting reality to make Brittany the center of the universe and casting me as the villain. The only difference was that this time, the stakes were much higher. They were actively trying to steal my home and destroy my professional reputation. My phone vibrated again. Brittany had tagged me in a new video post. I felt a cold knot form deep in my stomach. I tapped the notification and the video began to play. Brittany was sitting on the edge of a bed in a dimly lit, dingy room that looked exactly like a cheap roadside motel. The walls were painted a depressing shade of beige, casting harsh shadows. She was wearing no makeup, and her hair was pulled back into a messy, unkempt bun. In the background, 3-year-old Emma was sitting on the floor looking tired and confused, while 5-year-old Leo was quietly pushing a toy car across the stained carpet. Brittany stared directly into the camera lens. Her eyes were red and puffy, welling with heavy tears that looked entirely genuine to anyone who did not know her as well as I did. "Hi, everyone," Brittany said, her voice shaking with perfectly practiced vulnerability. "I normally do not post personal things like this online, but we are in a really desperate situation today. Kevin and I just had the worst morning of our entire lives. She paused, letting a single tear roll slowly down her cheek. We were supposed to move into a new house today. We had it all planned out, but at the very last minute, we were completely abandoned by a greedy family member. Someone who has more than enough space. Someone we trusted with all our hearts decided to lock us out and call the police on us when we showed up with our moving truck. Now my babies and I are sitting in this cheap motel room, and I have absolutely no idea what we are going to do. We are practically homeless. The video ended with a heartbreaking shot of Emma looking up sadly at the camera. I stared at my phone in stunned silence. The sheer level of manipulation was truly staggering. Brittany had completely omitted the fact that the house belonged to me, that she had never been invited, and that they had tried to physically force their way inside. She simply painted a picture of an innocent mother betrayed by a wealthy, heartless relative. I looked at the engagement metrics below the video. It had only been live for 20 minutes, but it was already going viral within our social circle. It had dozens of shares and over 100 angry comments. People I had known since childhood were leaving comments offering to set up donation funds for Brittany. A few of my cousins were already replying to those comments, tagging my name and linking directly to my professional business profile. I left Brittany's video paused on the final frame with Emma staring toward the camera and the motel lamp casting a yellow shadow across the wall. Every instinct my family had trained into me demanded an immediate response. I could have typed out the police report number, uploaded photographs of the crushed sprinklers, and explained that nobody had ever invited them to move into my home. I could have answered every aunt, cousin, and old family friend one by one. That was exactly what Patricia wanted. She wanted me exhausted, defensive, and emotional enough to make one careless statement she could tear out of context. I opened the family group chat instead. The unread counter was still climbing. Richard had posted that I was refusing to speak because I knew I was wrong. Patricia claimed the officers had been embarrassed by my behavior. Brittany added a photograph of Leo, asleep on the motel bed, and wrote that innocent children were paying for my greed. Beneath it, relatives competed to condemn me. Some demanded that I surrender the keys. Others threatened to call Grandma Beatrice themselves. One cousin suggested contacting my employer to expose the kind of person the company had promoted. For several seconds, my thumb hovered above the reply field. Then, I deleted the sentence I had started, opened the conversation settings, and selected Mute Indefinitely. I disabled notifications from Brittany's post, restricted comments on my professional profile, and saved screenshots of every direct threat. Silence was not surrender. It was the first decision I had made that they could not manipulate. I carried my phone into the home office and created a folder labeled Family Property Incident. Into it went photographs of the tire trenches, the broken sprinkler heads, the boxes Kevin had placed on my steps, and the patrol car parked behind my parents' SUV. I added the time-stamped messages in which my mother ordered me to bring keys, and my father described the move as a decision already made. If anyone contacted my employer or attempted another forced entry, I would have a clean chronological record. The process steadied me. At work, I managed supply chains that crossed ports, warehouses, carriers, and regulatory systems. When a shipment failed, the loudest explanation was rarely the real one. I traced dates, incentives, missing documents, and the person who benefited from the disruption. My family's crisis had the same structure. The emotional noise was enormous, but the basic logistics did not make sense. Brittany said her lease had expired that morning. A lease expiration was predictable. It appeared on a signed contract months in advance. Kevin had a stable corporate position, and Brittany regularly described herself online as a successful regional sales professional. Two employed adults with two young children did not discover at sunrise that they needed housing by breakfast. Even if a renewal had fallen through, they could have rented another apartment, placed their furniture in storage, or accepted one of the rooms in my parents' 5-bedroom house. Instead, they had arrived with a loaded truck, complete confidence, and my parents ready to supervise. That meant the plan had existed long before I received my keys. I opened a blank document and listed the inconsistencies. No request for temporary help. No discussion of rent. No proposed move-out date. No explanation for why Richard and Patricia would not host them. No concern about damaging my property. Most revealing of all, Brittany had used the words lease expired, while my mother kept saying, save money for a few years. Those were not descriptions of an emergency. They were pieces of a long-term arrangement designed without my consent. I considered calling Kevin's employer or Brittany's apartment manager, but I refused to cross into harassment or rumor gathering. I needed records that could be verified independently. County court filings, property records, recorded judgments, and business registrations would tell me more than another argument ever could. I moved my laptop to the granite kitchen island, connected the charger, and opened the county clerk's public access portal. The site was plain and bureaucratic, built around search fields rather than storytelling. I entered Brittany's full legal name, Kevin's name, their previous address, and the county where their apartment complex was located. The portal returned several possible matches, so I paid the $12 processing fee for the Consolidated Civil Records Report. A receipt appeared in my email. The system warned that archived documents could take several minutes to assemble. While the search processed, I reviewed Brittany's claim again. She had said the landlord would charge a penalty if they were not out by 8 in the morning. Yet the moving truck had already been packed, my parents had already arranged to arrive, and nobody had mentioned collecting a security deposit or completing a walkthrough. Kevin had not acted like a tenant ending a normal lease. He had acted like a man fleeing a deadline. The blue progress bar moved slowly across the screen. My muted phone continued to glow with messages I could no longer hear. For the first time that day, their campaign felt distant. Facts were forming a wall between their version of me and the truth. I also checked the county court calendar. A lawful removal required notices, a hearing, a judgment, and time for enforcement. That sequence eliminated the possibility that Brittany had discovered the problem that morning. If a judgment existed, she and Kevin had received documents, deadlines, and opportunities to respond. My parents could not plausibly have loaded a truck and coordinated their arrival without knowing the situation well in advance. I wrote one final note beneath my list. Do not accuse anyone until the records are complete. An incomplete allegation would help Richard portray me as unstable. I needed the exact court language, dates, and amount owed. The truth had to survive every denial they could manufacture. When the progress indicator reached 90%, I saved the group chat screenshots to a second location and emailed the incident folder to myself, preserving the original timestamps in the file. A notification finally appeared, report ready. I downloaded the PDF, saved an untouched copy to my evidence folder, and opened it. The first page contained routine address history. The second listed a small traffic matter involving Kevin. Then I reached the Civil Judgments Index and saw an entry from the apartment management company. The filing date was 6 weeks earlier. The case status was not renewal, dispute voluntary move or expired lease. It read, residential eviction judgment entered for plaintiff. I clicked the attached docket. A scanned order filled the screen bearing the court seal and the signatures of the property manager's attorney. The language was direct. Brittany and Kevin had been ordered to vacate after repeated notices and a completed hearing. A sheriff's enforcement date appeared near the bottom of the page. I sat back, the room suddenly silent around me. My sister had not been surprised by an expiring lease. She had known for weeks that a court was removing her. My parents had known too. The motel video, the children on my porch, and the loaded truck were not the aftermath of bad luck. They were the final stage of a coordinated lie. I scrolled to the next page where the amount owed was itemized. The first line made my stomach tighten. This was not one missed payment caused by an emergency. The balance covered 6 consecutive months of unpaid rent. The eviction ledger spread across 3 pages. Each month showed the same pattern: rent charged, payment absent, late fee added, notice issued. By the 6th month, legal fees and property charges had pushed the total far beyond what a normal security deposit could cover. The management company had documented emails, certified letters, and 2 failed payment arrangements. Brittany and Kevin had not been blindsided. They had ignored every opportunity to correct the problem until the sheriff's deadline made their denial impossible. I read the filing twice, separating what the court proved from what my sister had claimed online. Her video called the motel a sudden emergency. The docket showed that the first formal demand for payment had been delivered nearly half a year earlier. She said a greedy relative had abandoned her at the last minute. In reality, she had spent weeks preparing to occupy my house while hiding the legal reason she needed it. The records explained the eviction, but not where their money had gone. Kevin's job had not disappeared, and Brittany had continued posting about sales meetings and commissions. I opened her public social media profile and scrolled backward, matching every photograph to the dates on the unpaid rent ledger. During the month of the first missed payment, Brittany and Kevin had flown to the Bahamas. Her album contained dozens of photographs from a waterfront resort, a private balcony, a catamaran excursion, elaborate dinners, and matching designer luggage. In one picture, Brittany held a tropical drink while displaying a new handbag whose retail price was higher than a month of rent. The caption praised choosing experiences over fear and promised that abundance followed bold decisions. The following month, Patricia commented beneath a photograph of Brittany in a luxury boutique, calling her beautiful girl and telling her she deserved every blessing. That same week, the apartment manager had issued a second notice to pay or vacate. My parents had not merely failed to notice the problem, they had applauded the spending that deepened it. 2 months later, Brittany's feed changed. The vacation photographs gave way to polished videos filmed in her apartment. Cardboard cartons of health supplements were stacked behind her like a warehouse display. She announced that she had joined a revolutionary wellness company and invited followers to become independent partners. Her language was full of financial freedom, passive income, and escaping the limits of ordinary employment. I searched the company's name. Consumer complaints, distributor disclosures, and court filings appeared immediately. Participants were required to purchase large monthly inventories to maintain their status. Most earned little or nothing after expenses. Brittany's own posts revealed that she had ordered premium packages paid for, conferences, rented hotel suites for recruitment events, and purchased branded merchandise. Comments beneath the videos showed potential customers asking for refunds or saying their orders had never arrived. The timeline was brutal. Every time the landlord demanded rent, Brittany bought more inventory. Every time a payment plan failed, she posted another motivational speech about investing in herself. The products piled up while the legal notices accumulated. I checked the dates carefully, refusing to assume that every purchase had come from the loan, or that every post proved a separate expense. I only preserved what was visible and verifiable. Even under that cautious standard, the pattern was undeniable. Her homelessness was not caused by a single mistake. It was the predictable result of 6 months spent protecting an online fantasy instead of her children's home. I saved copies of the public posts, including their visible dates and links, then returned to the court report. The evidence already destroyed the story Patricia had spread through the family. Still, a larger question remained. My parents lived less than 20 minutes away, in a 5-bedroom colonial with 2 guest rooms, a finished basement, and more square footage than my new house. They treated Brittany as the center of their lives. If they believed she and the children were victims, why had they not opened their own door? Noise and inconvenience were not enough to explain it. Patricia would normally enjoy performing generosity in front of the neighborhood. Richard would have turned the rescue into a speech about family leadership. Instead, both of them had risked police intervention to place Brittany's expenses inside my home. Their urgency suggested that housing her themselves would expose or worsen a financial problem they were hiding. I returned to the public records portal and started a second search. This time I entered Richard's full legal name, Patricia's name, and the address of their estate. I selected property filings, civil judgments, recorded, security interests, and business-related documents. Another $12 charge appeared, followed by the same slow progress bar. While I waited, I examined the numbers I could see. Supporting 4 additional people would mean groceries, utilities, transportation, childcare, emergencies, and constant household costs. My parents had always presented themselves as wealthy enough to absorb those expenses. If they could not, then their wealth was either less secure than they claimed or already committed elsewhere. The results loaded. Their original deed appeared first, followed by mortgage refinancing documents and routine tax records. Nothing unusual surfaced until I reached a filing dated 4 months earlier. The title referenced a business venture loan and named Richard and Patricia as obligors. I opened the scanned attachment. The first page identified the principal amount, $150,000. The interest rate was far above a conventional mortgage, and the repayment schedule began almost immediately. Although the document described the funds as business capital, the attached purpose statement named the same wellness distribution venture Brittany had promoted online. I moved through the pages carefully. The lender had required personal guarantees. An addendum listed default remedies, collection costs, and the right to pursue the guarantor's assets through legal process. Recent notices attached to the filing showed missed installments and accelerating penalties. The account was already in default. My pulse slowed rather than quickened. This was the missing incentive. Richard and Patricia had guaranteed the money that financed Brittany's failed scheme. If she and Kevin could not pay, the lender would pursue them. Their country club life, luxury vehicles, and carefully protected home were all exposed. Their urgency was the behavior of guarantors, watching collection close in on everything they owned at once. I reached the final pages and slowed down. The loan file included a guarantee schedule. Brittany and Kevin were identified as the business borrowers. Beneath their names were spaces for additional parties whose assets could be pursued if the venture failed. The first signature line was partly hidden by the edge of the scan, and I could see only the date and the beginning of a familiar capital letter. I adjusted the magnification and waited for the image to sharpen. The lender's certification stamp came into focus, followed by a notarization block confirming that every signer had appeared voluntarily. This was not an informal promise or a family IOU that Richard could dismiss as a misunderstanding. It was a formal guarantee tied to a 6-figure obligation. The final portion of the page loaded one narrow band at a time. A sweeping signature appeared beneath the guarantor label. Beside it was another name, written in the precise slanted hand I had seen on school forms and holiday cards throughout my childhood. I stopped breathing. Before I read the typed names printed below the lines, I already knew exactly whose familiar handwriting I was looking at. There, at the bottom of the final page, perfectly preserved in dark digital ink, were the bold and sweeping signatures of my father and my mother. They sat directly next to the unsteady and cramped signatures of Brittany and Kevin. I scrolled back up to the very top of the commercial lending agreement to trace the precise timeline and read the specific terms of the massive sum of money they had borrowed. The document was explicitly categorized as a high-risk personal business venture injection. It was drafted and signed just over 6 months ago. That was the exact same time Brittany had aggressively flooded her social media feeds with highly produced videos announcing her revolutionary new health supplement business. My parents had fully bankrolled her predatory, multi-level marketing scheme. They had co-signed a staggering $150,000 loan, gambling a massive amount of capital on a business model that was statistically guaranteed to fail. I read through the attached addendums and the most recent status updates filed by the commercial lending institution. The language used by the bank was absolutely ruthless. The loan was not just delinquent, it was in total, catastrophic default. Brittany and Kevin had completely drained the initial capital to fund their lavish tropical vacations and designer wardrobes, deliberately ignoring the monthly repayment schedule entirely. The lending institution had officially initiated the preliminary legal steps to recoup their losses. Because Richard and Patricia were the primary co-signers, the bank was preparing to place a massive lien against their primary residence and their retirement assets. If my parents did not produce a massive sum of money to catch up on the defaulted payments and cover the exorbitant late fees they were facing, imminent financial ruin. The air in my kitchen felt suddenly thin. I pushed my chair back from the island and stood up, pacing slowly across the polished hardwood floor. The horrifying truth of their grand plan snapped into perfect, agonizing focus. Every single confusing puzzle piece locked together to form a picture of unimaginable parental betrayal. My parents did not want Brittany and her children to move into my home out of some deep, abiding sense of family love or protective duty. They were not trying to help my sister save money to buy a new house. They were desperately trying to save themselves from a devastating, highly public bankruptcy. If they took Brittany and Kevin into their own spacious 5-bedroom colonial estate, my parents would have to shoulder the enormous financial burden of feeding, housing, and supporting a family of 4. They simply could not afford to absorb those daily living costs while simultaneously fighting off the bank to save their own luxury assets. So they orchestrated a completely different strategy. They decided to force Brittany and Kevin into my house instead. They fully intended for me to unknowingly absorb the total cost of my sister's housing, her grocery bills, and her utility usage. By forcing me to become the sole financial provider for her family, Brittany and Kevin would be able to surrender 100% of their monthly paychecks directly to my parents. I was being explicitly set up as an unwitting, disposable financial human shield. My parents were fully prepared to sacrifice my peace, my home, and my financial stability just to secretly pay down their defaulted loan and protect their precious social standing at the country club. A profound, icy calm settled deeply into my bones. The intense burning anger that had consumed me earlier was completely gone. In its place was a sharp, clinical focus. I walked back over to my laptop and connected it to the wireless printer I had set up in my home office the night before. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel the urge to call my mother and scream at her. I simply clicked the print icon. I systematically printed every single page of the eviction notice from the county court. I printed the itemized list of 6 months of unpaid rent. I printed screenshots of Brittany's social media posts showing her sipping cocktails on a catamaran in the Bahamas during the exact same weeks she was legally ignoring her housing payments. Finally, I printed the entire defaulted loan agreement, making absolutely sure the page containing my parents' signatures was clear, crisp, and undeniable. I walked into my home office and opened a moving box labeled desk supplies. I dug through the packing paper until I found a sleek, heavy black leather binder. I brought the binder back out to the kitchen island and opened the metal rings. I began organizing the freshly printed documents with meticulous chronological precision. First went the social media posts establishing the lavish lifestyle. Next went the multi-level marketing business announcements. Then came the devastating court eviction judgments showing the unpaid rent. And serving as the grand finale of the collection, I inserted the $150,000 defaulted loan agreement with the looming threat of an asset lien. I snapped the metal rings shut. The binder looked completely professional, like a presentation for a corporate board meeting. In reality, it was a perfectly assembled financial execution. It was undeniable, verified proof of their absolute moral bankruptcy. I ran my hands smoothly over the textured black leather cover. I felt a deep, resonant sense of power. My entire life, my parents had relied on my silence and my compliance to maintain their perfect image. They had always controlled the family narrative because I had never possessed the concrete evidence needed to expose their lies. But now I held their complete financial ruin and social destruction right in the palm of my hands. I knew I could not just send these documents in a text message. I could not just email them to the extended family group chat. Patricia would find a way to spin a digital confrontation. She would claim I forged the documents or that I was having a mental breakdown. If I was going to deploy this weapon, I needed to do it in an environment where they could not escape, where they could not control the narrative, and where the people who mattered most would see the truth with their own eyes. Just as I was contemplating the logistics of how to properly confront them, a notification bell chimed loudly from my laptop speakers. I glanced over at the screen. A new email had just arrived in my personal inbox. The sender name was listed as Richard, but the subject line indicated it was a formal event invitation. I clicked to open the message, my eyes scanning the elegant, digitally embossed text. It was a formal invitation to Grandma Beatrice's 82nd birthday dinner. The event was scheduled to take place this coming Saturday evening. The venue was the private dining room at the prestigious Oakmont Country Club, the most exclusive and expensive establishment in our entire city. It was the absolute crown jewel of my parents' social universe. Below the formal invitation graphics, my father had typed a direct personal message addressed specifically to me. The tone of his text completely abandoned the charming, reasonable father act he had tried to play for the police officers on my lawn. His words were sharp, threatening, and dripping with aggressive confidence. Michelle, attend the dinner, hand over the house keys to your sister, and publicly apologize. Do not ever test us again. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop, letting the sheer, unfiltered arrogance of my father's written command sink into my skin. He had not asked for a conversation. He had not requested a compromise. He had issued a direct, non-negotiable order, fully expecting me to fall back into line like the obedient, easily manipulated daughter I used to be. The demand to publicly apologize to my sister after she had driven a commercial moving truck onto my property and attempted to force her way into my home was so entirely disconnected from reality that it bordered on clinical delusion. I read the short, aggressive sentence again. Do not ever test us again. He genuinely believed he still held all the cards. He believed he still controlled the board. He had absolutely no idea that I was sitting at my kitchen island with a comprehensive, legally binding dossier of his catastrophic financial ruin resting just inches from my fingertips. Before I could even process the full audacity of the email, my cell phone began to vibrate violently across the smooth quartz countertop. The harsh buzzing sound shattered the quiet peace of my kitchen. I glanced down at the bright screen. The caller identification displayed my father's name in bold white letters. He was not going to wait for a digital response. He wanted to deliver his threats in person, relying on the old, familiar tactics of vocal intimidation that had kept me in check for the past 3 decades. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling my heart rate remain incredibly steady and perfectly calm. I reached out, picked up the phone, and pressed the green button to accept the call. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply raised the glass screen to my ear and waited for him to speak. "Michelle, are you reading my email?" Richard demanded. His voice lacked any trace of the warm, charming, fatherly tone he used when speaking to his country club friends or the local police officers. It was a cold, sharp, and entirely ruthless tone. It was the voice of a cornered man, desperately trying to exert dominance. Yes, I am reading it, I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotional inflection. I was just marveling at the incredible delusion required to send it. My father let out a harsh, bitter scoff that crackled through the phone speaker. "You think you are so smart," he growled, the anger vibrating heavily in his chest. "You think because you bought a big house and got a fancy corporate title that you can suddenly disrespect this family and humiliate your mother on your front porch? You think you are untouchable, but you are not. You are going to attend your grandmother Beatrice's birthday dinner this Saturday night at the Oakmont Country Club. You are going to wear a nice dress, you are going to smile, and you are going to stand up in front of the entire extended family and publicly apologize to your sister for locking her out. And then you are going to hand over a set of house keys to Kevin." I listened to his demands, analyzing the frantic, desperate energy hiding just beneath his aggressive posturing. He needed this public display of submission. He needed the extended family to see me hand over the keys, because that was the only way he could seamlessly force Brittany into my house without raising suspicion about his own financial motives. If I gave her the keys voluntarily, in front of everyone, it would look like a generous act of sisterly love, completely masking the fact that they were facing an imminent, devastating bankruptcy. "And what exactly makes you think I would ever agree to do that?" I asked quietly, letting the silence stretch for a moment. "What makes you think I will ever let those people step foot on my property again? Because if you do not do exactly what I am telling you to do," my father hissed, his voice dropping into a dark, venomous threat, "I will call Beatrice tonight. I will tell her that you have gone completely insane. I will tell her that you are maliciously hoarding wealth and actively putting your innocent niece and nephew out on the cold streets. You know exactly how your grandmother views family loyalty, Michelle. She keeps his selfishness. If we tell her what you did today, she will immediately contact her attorneys. She will write you out of the family trust entirely. You will not see a single dime of that inheritance. You will lose everything, and you will be a total outcast in this family for the rest of your life." The threat hung heavy in the air, a massive, calculated strike aimed directly at what he assumed was my greatest vulnerability. Grandma Beatrice was the undisputed, formidable matriarch of our entire extended family. She was a wealthy, sharp-minded, no-nonsense woman whose approval dictated the social and financial standing of every single relative. The family trust she controlled was substantial, representing a massive safety net of generational wealth. My father was banking his entire strategy on the profound assumption that I would be absolutely terrified of losing Beatrice's favor. He believed that the mere threat of being financially cut off and socially exiled by the matriarch would be enough to break my spirit and force me to surrender my home. He thought I was just as obsessed with the family inheritance and country club optics as he was. What Richard did not understand, and what he fundamentally lacked the capacity to comprehend, was that I had never factored that trust fund into my future. I had spent my entire adult life building my own wealth, securing my own assets, and establishing an independent career, precisely so I would never have to rely on anyone else's money. I did not need a penny from Grandma Beatrice to pay my mortgage. I was entirely self-sufficient. But more importantly, my father's threat was steeped in breathtaking, staggering hypocrisy. He was threatening to use Beatrice as a weapon against me, while simultaneously hiding the fact that he was drowning in a defaulted $150,000 loan. He was projecting his own desperate reliance on family money onto me to maintain his false authority. Before I could formulate a response to his hollow, pathetic ultimatum, I heard the loud rustling of a phone changing hands. Patricia had evidently been listening to the entire conversation in the background. She snatched the phone from my father, her voice shrill and dripping with a toxic, manipulative sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Be a good girl for once, Michelle," my mother commanded. her tone incredibly sharp and severely condescending. "Stop throwing these ridiculous dramatic tantrums and do what you are told. Do not embarrass us in front of the country club this weekend. You owe your sister this favor. Fix your sister's mistake or you are completely dead to us. Do you understand me? You will have no parents, no sister, and no family left. You will be entirely alone." I stood in my beautiful, quiet kitchen, holding the phone to my ear, as the weight of her horrible, cruel words washed over me. For 33 years, the threat of being unloved and abandoned by them had kept me trapped in a constant cycle of people-pleasing and desperate overachievement. I had spent my entire life trying to be the good girl she was demanding me to be. But hearing her say it now, knowing the profound depth of their financial absolute willingness to destroy my life to save themselves, the threat held absolutely no power over me. I felt no fear. I felt no sadness. I felt only a cold, perfect clarity. I looked down at the black leather binder resting on my kitchen island, filled with the undeniable, verified proof of their impending ruin. "I will be there," I replied, my voice calm, steady, and chillingly empty of any warmth. "And I will make sure everyone gets exactly what they deserve." I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call, severing the connection before she could scream another word. I set the device face down on the smooth quartz countertop. I stared at the black leather binder, feeling the heavy, satisfying weight of the truth waiting inside it. The trap was set, and I was going to burn their false empire to the very ground. I sat in the profound silence of my kitchen, the adrenaline from the phone call slowly giving way to a cold and calculating focus. Bringing a fixed stack of financial documents to a country club dinner was a good starting point, but my professional experience in supply chain logistics had taught me that raw data is completely useless without the proper narrative context. If I simply threw the papers onto the dining table, my father would immediately launch into a desperate defense. He would try to confuse the older relatives with financial jargon, claiming the loan was a complex corporate investment or a temporary cash flow maneuver. He was a master of spinning reality, and he would undoubtedly use the confusion of the moment to make me look like a hysterical, vindictive daughter taking things out of proportion. To execute this strike flawlessly, I really needed to know the exact false narrative he had already planted in the minds of our extended family. I needed to understand the precise baseline of his lies so I could dismantle them piece by specific piece. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name of a longtime family friend. Diane was an older woman who played tennis with my mother and sat on several local charity boards with my father. She was notoriously gossipy, but had always maintained a soft spot for me. I dialed her number, keeping my tone light and casually inquisitive when she answered. I made small talk before gently steering the conversation toward the upcoming birthday dinner and the recent family tension. Diane, eager to share what she knew, immediately took the bait. She lowered her voice into a conspiratorial whisper and revealed everything. According to Diane, my father had been actively holding court at the country club all week. He was telling anyone who would listen that his financial portfolios were yielding record-high returns and that he was entirely debt-free. He painted a tragic picture of my sister, claiming Brittany was just going through a brief transition period. The most sickening part of his lie, however, was his portrayal of me. He told the entire social circle I was consumed by modern corporate greed and that my petty jealousy was causing tension within our perfect family. Hearing those words confirmed exactly what I was up against. I thanked Diane for her time, politely ended the call, and returned my attention to the black leather binder. The documents inside were devastating, but they needed to be absolutely undeniable at a mere glance. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a bright yellow highlighter. I approached the paperwork with the exact same ruthless efficiency I used when auditing failing corporate vendors. I flipped to the eviction notice and highlighted the bold text that explicitly stated the cause of eviction was 6 months of completely unpaid rent. I flagged the pages showing Brittany and Kevin's luxurious tropical vacations, marking the dates, to show they were sipping cocktails on a beach while actively ignoring their housing payments. Then I turned to the final, most crucial document of all, the $150,000 personal loan agreement. I highlighted the date it was issued, clearly linking it to Brittany's fraudulent multi-level marketing venture. I drew a bright yellow line directly across the massive principal amount. I did not stop there. I walked over to my home office printer and made 5 high-quality color copies of the entire annotated packet. I placed each set into a sleek, transparent presentation folder. I was not just going to slide a single binder across the table and let my father snatch it away. I was going to distribute individual comprehensive copies to the most influential members of the family simultaneously. I was preparing a targeted, inescapable financial execution. As I organized the presentation folders, stacking them neatly on my kitchen island, a profound wave of moral clarity washed over me. I stopped moving and simply looked around my quiet, beautiful home. I thought about the 33 years of my life that had led up to this exact moment. I had always been the designated scapegoat of this family. I was the child who was never quite good enough, never quite charming enough, and never worthy of their unconditional support. While Brittany was handed everything on a silver platter, I had paid my own way through every single milestone. I had worked double shifts in high school just to afford basic necessities. I had taken out massive student loans and worked full-time through college to earn my degree. I had spent a decade building a highly demanding career in supply chain management, fighting for every promotion and salary increase. My parents had never celebrated those victories. They had only ever viewed my independence as a threat to their control, or as a convenient resource they could exploit when Brittany inevitably failed. For my entire life, I had swallowed my pride and kept the peace. I had accepted their glaring double standards because I believed that if I just worked hard enough, they would eventually love me the way they loved her. But staring at the defaulted loan documents bearing my parents' signatures, I finally understood the brutal truth. They did not love Brittany more because she was better. They favored her because she was weak, dependent, and easily controlled. My independence was a mirror that reflected their own failures, and they hated me for it. This upcoming dinner at the country club was no longer just about defending my 4-bedroom house. It was about destroying the false, suffocating narrative that had haunted me for over 3 decades. I closed the final presentation folder, running my hand across the smooth plastic cover. The trap was perfectly constructed, but there was still one massive, unpredictable variable remaining on the board: Grandma Beatrice. My father was incredibly confident that he could use the matriarch as a weapon against me. He was banking his entire strategy on the assumption that Beatrice would blindly take his side and use her immense financial power to crush my resistance. Beatrice was a sharp, fiercely intelligent woman, but she was in her 80s and isolated in her sprawling estate. If my father had been actively poisoning the country club social circle with lies about my greed, there was no doubt he had been feeding the exact same toxic narrative to my grandmother. I realized that allowing my parents to control Grandma Beatrice's perspective going into that dinner would be a catastrophic tactical error. I could not simply wait for Saturday night and hope the documents would be enough to overcome whatever emotional manipulation my father had already subjected her to. I needed to ensure that the matriarch was asking the right questions before my father ever had the chance to deliver his public ultimatum. I made a swift, decisive choice. I grabbed my car keys from the ceramic bowl by the front door. I did not take the black leather binder or the presentation folders. I was not going to overwhelm her with raw data just yet. I was going to execute a quiet, highly calculated preemptive strike. I walked out of my front door, locked the deadbolt securely behind me, and got into my car. I pulled out of my driveway, turning my vehicle directly toward the wealthy historic district, and began the long drive to Grandma Beatrice's estate. The drive to the wealthy historic district took just under an hour in the late afternoon traffic. Grandma Beatrice lived in a stone mansion. It sat on pristine landscaping, shielded from the main road by a wrought iron gate and ancient oak trees. This estate was the physical manifestation of the generational wealth my father so desperately weaponized. As I pulled onto the circular driveway, I took a steadying breath. I knew Beatrice better than anyone else truly gave her credit for. My father treated her like a bank, and my mother treated her like a social stepping stone. But I knew Beatrice as a sharp, observant woman who valued absolute integrity. She detested liars and built her formidable reputation by seeing through empty flattery. I parked near the grand front entrance, leaving the heavy black leather binder locked securely inside the glove compartment. Bringing it inside now would be a tactical error. Presenting the raw financial data in the privacy of her living room would clear my name, but it would lack the public impact required to permanently dismantle my father's false empire. He needed to be exposed in front of the audience he had been poisoning against me. I walked up the stone steps and rang the brass doorbell, listening to the resonant chime echo through the massive house. The heavy oak door swung open, revealing Beatrice standing in the foyer. She remained a striking, formidable presence. She stood perfectly straight, wearing a tailored navy blue dress and her signature string of pearls. Her sharp gray eyes scanned my face, missing absolutely nothing. She greeted me with a smile, stepping forward to pull me into a firm embrace. I returned the hug, feeling a sudden wave of emotion. Amidst all the betrayal my parents had orchestrated, standing in my grandmother's foyer felt like the first moment of actual safety. But as she pulled back, the warmth in her eyes shifted into a calculating curiosity. She guided me into her sitting room, gesturing for me to take a seat on the velvet sofa opposite her armchair. We exchanged brief pleasantries about the drive over, but Beatrice was never one to waste time on small talk. She sat back, folding her hands neatly in her lap, and looked at me with intense scrutiny. "Michelle," she began, her voice carrying the quiet, unwavering authority she was famous for. "Your father called me yesterday afternoon. He was exceedingly distressed. He has been telling me, and apparently half the country club, some very disturbing rumors about your recent behavior. He claims you have become incredibly hostile, that you maliciously locked your sister out of your home, and that you are actively trying to put your innocent niece and nephew out on the street." I sat still, letting the sheer toxicity of my father's lies wash over me. Hearing the false narratives spoken aloud confirmed exactly how desperate my parents had become. They were systematically laying the groundwork to destroy my reputation, painting me as an unhinged villain to isolate me from any potential family support. A lesser version of myself, the version that had spent 3 decades terrified of being misunderstood, would have immediately launched into a defense. I would have run out to my car, grabbed the binder, and tearfully begged Beatrice to look at the eviction notices and the defaulted loan documents. I would have tried to prove my innocence right then and there. But my career in supply chain management had trained me to approach volatile situations with cold, clinical logic. An emotional defense looks exactly like guilt to an objective observer. If I wanted to completely dismantle my father's illusion, I had to let him finish building his own trap first. I looked directly into my grandmother's sharp gray eyes, maintaining a calm posture. I did not raise my voice, and I did not offer a single defensive excuse regarding Brittany's living situation. Instead, I decided to execute the preemptive strike I had planned. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on my knees, and asked a very specific question. "Grandma," I said, keeping my tone entirely conversational, Has Dad asked you for any large sums of money recently? The question hung in the quiet sitting room, shifting the dynamic of the conversation. Beatrice visibly stiffened her eyebrows, drawing together in a deep frown. She looked puzzled, caught off guard by the sudden pivot away from the drama surrounding my sister. She was a woman who prided herself on controlling every negotiation, and my total lack of defensiveness clearly unsettled her. She studied my face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception or malice. Finding none, she slowly relaxed her posture, her analytical mind immediately engaging with the implication behind my words. "Why on earth would you ask me something like that?" she asked, her voice dropping to a cautious, hushed tone. I simply held her gaze, offering a reassuring nod, silently encouraging her to answer the question without revealing my own cards just yet. Beatrice let out a troubled sigh, her gaze drifting toward the large bay window overlooking the manicured gardens. "Yes, actually," she admitted, the reluctance evident in her measured words. "Richard came to see me privately 3 days ago. He requested a $200,000 early disbursement from the family trust." I felt a cold chill radiate down my spine as she spoke the number aloud, but I kept my expression entirely neutral. "He claimed he needed the capital immediately to invest in a commercial real estate venture," she continued, her frown deepening. "He said it was a time-sensitive opportunity that would yield massive returns, but he refused to provide the specific investment portfolios when I asked to review them." The final puzzle piece slammed into place with absolute sickening clarity. My parents were not just trying to use me as a financial human shield to absorb my sister's living expenses. They were actively attempting to defraud their own elderly mother to secure the cash required to cover their defaulted loan and late fees. They were facing an asset lien from the commercial bank, and they were willing to steal $250,000 from the family trust under the false pretense of a lucrative real estate investment just to save their country club status. They were bleeding out from multiple financial wounds, and they were desperately trying to drain both me and Beatrice dry before the extended family discovered the truth. My father had painted me as the villain to distract Beatrice from his own catastrophic moral failure. I felt a tight, dangerous smile pull at the corners of my mouth. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt an overwhelming sense of absolute, terrifying power. I knew exactly how this war was going to end. I slowly stood up from the velvet sofa, smoothing the front of my slacks with steady, relaxed hands. I looked down at my grandmother, who was watching me with a mixture of deep concern and growing realization. I did not tell her about the eviction. I did not mention the failed multi-level marketing scheme or the massive high-interest personal loan bearing my parents' signatures. I simply offered her the final, devastating piece of advice that she would desperately need to survive the impending fallout. "Keep your checkbook closed until tomorrow night," I told Beatrice, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "You are going to want to hear Dad's speech." I walked out of my grandmother's grand stone foyer and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me, the solid click of the latch echoing in the quiet evening air. I descended the stone steps with a brisk, purposeful stride, climbed back into my car, and pulled out of the sprawling historic estate. As I navigated the winding, tree-lined streets back toward the highway, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement provided the perfect backdrop for my mind to fully process the staggering magnitude of my parents' deceit. I had previously thought their plan was merely a desperate, ruthless attempt at self-preservation. I had believed they were simply forcing Brittany into my house so they could hijack her income and slowly chip away at their massive defaulted loan. But hearing about the $200,000 early disbursement request from the family trust completely shifted my understanding of their depravity. They were not just trying to survive a financial crisis. They were actively orchestrating a highly calculated double scam. The defaulted commercial loan for Britney's fraudulent multi-level marketing venture was exactly $150,000. If they successfully pressured Beatrice into handing over $200,000 under the guise of a lucrative commercial real estate investment, they could immediately pay off the bank, erase the asset lien on their own luxury estate, and still have $50,000 left over in pure profit. But they were greedy. They never intended to let Brittany and Kevin off the hook. By manipulating the extended family into forcing my sister into my home, they were ensuring that I would unknowingly absorb the total cost of feeding and housing a family of 4. That meant my parents could still demand Brittany and Kevin's full paychecks every single month, essentially double-dipping to rapidly rebuild their own depleted retirement accounts, while completely insulating themselves from any personal sacrifice. They were attempting to scam Beatrice for the immediate lump sum and scam me for the long-term living expenses, all while positioning themselves as the generous, suffering patriarch and matriarch of a troubled family. The sheer audacity of their multi-layered financial manipulation was breathtaking. But as I pulled into my own driveway and parked inside my quiet, secure garage, I realized I did not feel a single ounce of anxiety. For the first time in 33 years, I was completely immune to their chaos. I unlocked the door leading into my kitchen and breathed in the peaceful, silent air of the home I had purchased with my own hard-earned money. I did not spend the rest of the evening frantically preparing arguments or crying over the profound lack of parental love. Instead, I changed into my most comfortable pair of sweatpants, opened a food delivery application on my phone, and ordered a massive combination of spicy tuna rolls and sashimi from my favorite local Japanese restaurant. While I waited for the food to arrive, I poured myself a generous glass of sparkling water and queued up a classic comedy movie on the television in my living room. I sat on my plush sectional sofa, eating premium sushi and genuinely laughing at the screen, utterly unbothered by the impending social explosion. My phone, however, was not nearly as relaxed. It vibrated continuously on the coffee table, lighting up the dim room with a steady stream of frantic, last-minute, manipulative text messages from my mother. I glanced over at the glowing screen periodically, reading her words with a detached, clinical amusement. "Michelle, I expect you to wear something modest tomorrow night," Patricia wrote in one message. "Your grandmother prefers conservative attire, and this is not the time for you to try and stand out." 10 minutes later, another message arrived. "Do not forget to bring the spare house keys for Kevin. Put them in a nice gift box so it looks presentable when you apologize to your sister." I did not respond to a single text. I simply let the notifications pile up, watching her desperately attempt to micromanage a reality she no longer controlled. When Saturday evening finally arrived, the air in my house felt charged with electric anticipation. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, analyzing my reflection with meticulous care. For every previous family event, country club dinner, or holiday gathering, my mother had relentlessly pressured me into wearing soft pastel dresses, pearl necklaces, and submissive blending silhouettes that fit her specific narrative of the dutiful, unremarkable daughter. She wanted me to look soft, compliant, and easily overshadowed by my sister's flashy designer gowns. Tonight, I was entirely rejecting that carefully constructed costume. I bypassed the dresses in my closet and reached for a pristine, sharply tailored suit I had specifically purchased for high-stakes corporate negotiations. The suit was a deep, authoritative charcoal gray, cut from premium Italian wool, that draped flawlessly over my shoulders and tapered perfectly at my waist. I paired it with a crisp, stark white silk blouse and sleek black leather pumps that clicked with absolute authority against the hardwood floor. I styled my hair in a sleek, professional blowout and applied a bold, striking shade of crimson lipstick that I would normally reserve for celebrating a massive supply chain victory. I did not look like the subservient, easily manipulated daughter my parents were expecting to publicly humiliate. I looked exactly like the senior supply chain director. I was a highly capable, fiercely independent executive who was perfectly accustomed to dismantling fraudulent vendors and firing deceitful contractors. I fastened my favorite silver watch around my wrist, checking the time. It was exactly 6 o'clock. The private dinner at the Oakmont Country Club was scheduled to begin at 6:30, and I intended to arrive with impeccable, calculated punctuality. I walked out of my bedroom and moved purposefully down the hallway, my heels echoing sharply through the quiet house. I paused at the kitchen island, where the sleek black leather binder rested exactly where I had left it the night before. Next to it sat the 5 transparent presentation folders, each one containing the annotated, color-copied evidence of my parents' financial devastation and moral bankruptcy. I carefully stacked the transparent folders, placing them neatly inside my spacious leather tote bag. Then I reached out and picked up the black leather binder. The physical weight of the evidence felt incredibly grounding in my hands. It was the heavy, undeniable manifestation of the truth. A lethal weapon, forged from their own signatures and their own arrogant mistakes. I ran my thumb over the textured cover one last time, taking a deep, steadying breath. I walked out the front door, locked the deadbolt securely behind me, and walked confidently down the driveway toward my car. The evening air was crisp and clear, the perfect weather for a high society gathering. I placed my tote bag on the passenger seat, slid behind the steering wheel, and started the engine. As I pulled out onto the street and pointed my car toward the wealthy, manicured hills of the Oakmont Country Club, a profound sense of calm settled deeply into my chest. My parents had spent my entire life building a grand, suffocating empire of lies, forcing me to live in the dark shadows of their deception. Tonight, I was finally bringing the hot fire, and I was absolutely, completely, entirely ready to burn their false empire to the very ground. The heavy oak double doors of the Oakmont Country Club loomed ahead. I handed my car keys to the valet, feeling the crisp evening air fade as I stepped into the opulent lobby. The muffled sounds of clinking crystal and polite laughter drifted through the wood. I paused, smoothing the lapels of my tailored suit, feeling the absolute truth inside my leather tote bag. I turned the brass handle and pushed the doors open, stepping confidently into the lion's den. The room was bathed in the golden glow of massive crystal chandeliers. A long mahogany dining table stretched across the center, adorned with white linen tablecloths, gleaming sterling silver, and towering floral centerpieces. The moment my black leather pumps clicked against the hardwood floor, the ambient chatter died instantly. It was a sharp, abrupt, and total silence, as if someone had severed the power line. I scanned the faces of my extended family. My uncles, aunts, and cousins, the very people who had flooded my phone with aggressive messages, all turned to look directly at me. Their expressions ranged from barely concealed disdain to blistering hostility. Uncle David paused with a wineglass hovering halfway to his mouth, his eyes narrowing in judgment. Aunt Carol leaned over to whisper behind her hand to her daughter, both staring with an unblinking, critical focus. They had all been fed my father's narrative. They fully believed I was the greedy villain who had maliciously abandoned my struggling sister. I did not flinch under their collective glare. I did not avert my gaze. I kept my chin held high, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression as I walked further into the room. The air felt thick with their disapproval, but it slid right off my shoulders. Near the head of the long table positioned where the honored guests would sit were my sister Brittany and her husband Kevin. Brittany wore a pale pink silk dress, chosen to make her look soft and vulnerable. She looked the picture of tragic innocence, but as our eyes locked, a deeply smug, satisfied gleam flashed across her face. She leaned against Kevin's shoulder. Kevin puffed out his chest, looking incredibly pleased with himself. They genuinely thought they had won this war. They thought this lavish dinner was a mere formality before I surrendered and handed over the keys to my home. Directly across from them sat my mother, Patricia. She wore a conservative, cream-colored blouse and her signature pearls, presenting the image of maternal grace. When she saw me, her lips stretched into a sickly sweet smile that did not reach the cold depths of her eyes. She raised her hand and gently patted the empty, high-backed chair directly next to her. It was a theatrical gesture, meant to visually demonstrate to the extended family exactly how forgiving she was, inviting her supposedly cruel daughter back into the warm family fold. She expected me to walk over, lower my head in submission, and take the seat of the defeated child. I felt a surge of disgust, marveling at how easily she could wear the mask of a loving mother while actively plotting my complete ruin. I walked toward the chair, my steps steady, measured, and unhurried. I did not offer a polite greeting to the hostile audience watching my every move. I pulled the heavy chair out and took my seat with practiced elegance. I set my leather tote bag gently on the floor. Then, with deliberate, highly visible movements, I reached inside and retrieved the thick black leather binder. I placed it squarely on the pristine white tablecloth, positioning it right next to my crystal water glass. I set it face down, the smooth, dark leather contrasting sharply against the bright linen. My mother glanced at the binder, a flicker of confusion crossing her features, before she smoothed it away. She likely assumed it was some sort of printed apology letter, or perhaps the property documents and spare house keys she had forcefully demanded I bring. At the head of the table sat Grandma Beatrice. She was dressed impeccably in a tailored navy blue suit, sitting with the rigid, perfect posture of a ruling monarch. Her sharp gray eyes missed absolutely nothing. She watched the entire social dynamic unfold, with intense scrutiny tracking my confident entrance, the silent hostility of the family, the smugness radiating from my sister, and the deliberate placement of my black binder. Beatrice caught my eye for a fraction of a second. She did not smile, but a look of intense calculation settled over her features. She remembered our private conversation in her sitting room perfectly. She knew my father had asked her for $200,000, and she knew I had told her to keep her checkbook closed. She was silently waiting for the show to begin. The waitstaff moved seamlessly into the room, breaking the heavy silence as they began pouring wine and serving the first course of roasted butternut squash soup. The agonizing, superficial small talk slowly resumed around the mahogany table. Relatives exchanged forced pleasantries about golf handicaps, tropical vacations, and stock market trends. The tension remained incredibly thick, humming dangerously just beneath the surface of the polite conversation. No one spoke directly to me. I was entirely ostracized, treated as an unwelcome ghost haunting their perfect gathering. I ate my soup calmly, savoring the rich flavors, completely undisturbed by their silent treatment. I watched my father hold court at the opposite end of the table, charming my uncles with practiced jokes and projecting the flawless image of a wealthy, unbothered, debt-free patriarch. The multi-course dinner dragged on for what felt like an eternity. Plates of seared filet mignon and truffle risotto were served, and eventually cleared away, replaced by the quiet clinking of heavy silverware against fine porcelain. I simply sat and observed them all, feeling the heavy, satisfying weight of the undeniable evidence sitting right beside my hand. I was watching a group of people build their own spectacular demise. The ambient noise of the dining room shifted as the waitstaff returned to serve dessert. Plates of dark chocolate ganache and raspberry tart were placed in front of each guest. The warm smell of rich coffee filled the air. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, sensing the change in my father's posture. He had been waiting all evening for this exact moment. The dessert plates had barely settled when Richard pushed his heavy chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He stood up straight, towering over the seated family members, adjusting the lapels of his expensive suit jacket. He reached out and picked up a silver dessert spoon. He very gently tapped the side of his crystal champagne flute. The clear, ringing chime cut directly through the low hum of conversation. Instantly, the entire room fell dead silent. Every single eye at the mahogany table turned toward him in anticipation. My father smiled widely, radiating an authority that he had perfected over decades of manipulation. He looked around the table, making sure he had the undivided attention of every family member, specifically ensuring Grandma Beatrice was watching him. Then his cold gaze locked directly onto mine. The elaborate trap he had spent all week laying was finally springing shut. He was fully preparing to deliver the brutal public execution of my independence, stepping into the bright spotlight to confidently issue his final, completely non-negotiable demands. Richard held his crystal champagne flute high, the ambient light from the massive chandeliers catching the rising bubbles. He looked down the length of the mahogany table, bypassing me entirely, to focus his warm, charismatic gaze directly on Grandma Beatrice. He began his speech with a practiced, velvety tone that immediately commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. He spoke eloquently about our family legacy, praising Beatrice as the unwavering matriarch who laid the foundation for our collective success. He painted a sweeping picture of generational wealth measured in loyalty, unity, and unconditional love. He effortlessly wove a narrative of a clan that never leaves one of its own behind, a family that recognizes the strength of the whole is dependent on individual sacrifice. My uncles nodded in solemn agreement. Aunt Carol wiped a manufactured tear from the corner of her eye. The extended family was completely captivated, eating out of the palm of his hand, entirely mesmerized by the flawless illusion of the perfect, supportive patriarch he was projecting. After thoroughly buttering up Beatrice and setting the stage with his grand philosophical declarations about duty, Richard allowed a heavy, dramatic pause to settle over the dining room. He lowered his glass slightly and shifted his posture, physically turning the immense weight of the room's attention away from the matriarch and directly onto me. The warm, inclusive smile he had directed at Beatrice morphed into an expression of profound, forgiving, paternal grace. It was the look of a benevolent king welcoming a wayward subject back into the fold. He looked at me with a sickening mixture of pride and ownership, projecting the image of a father who had successfully guided his troubled daughter out of the darkness of her own selfishness. He wanted everyone to see that he was the architect of my supposed redemption. Tonight we also celebrate the power of forgiveness and family duty, Richard announced grandly, his voice echoing perfectly through the quiet, private dining room. The silence was so profound that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents above us. He locked his cold, calculating eyes with mine, daring me to challenge the narrative he was weaving. Michelle has seen the error of her ways, he continued, projecting absolute authority. She has generously agreed to hand over the keys to her new home tonight, officially opening her doors to Brittany, Kevin, and the kids. He raised his champagne flute higher, a victorious, triumphant gleam shining in his eyes. "Let's raise a glass to Michelle for finally doing the right thing." The reaction was instantaneous and deeply nauseating. A wave of polite, approving applause rippled down the length of the long mahogany table. My extended family, the people who had spent all week berating me in group texts, were now smiling with condescending approval. Uncle David raised his glass in my direction, nodding as if I had just passed a difficult test. Aunt Carol clapped enthusiastically, whispering that she was relieved I had finally come to my senses. They were celebrating my total capitulation, congratulating me for surrendering the sanctuary I had built with a decade of my own hard work. At the head of the table, the smug antagonists were putting on the performance of a lifetime. Brittany let out a soft gasp, lifting her pale pink silk napkin to dab delicately at the corners of her eyes. She placed her hand over her heart, looking at me with a fabricated expression of overwhelming gratitude. Kevin put a heavy arm around her shoulders, puffing out his chest and offering a tight, condescending nod. He looked like a man who had secured a free luxury home without lifting a finger. They were genuinely convinced that my spirit had been entirely broken by our father's public pressure. Directly across from me, Patricia moved to seal the trap. She did not bother to hide the cold, victorious satisfaction radiating from her posture. She leaned forward, the pearls around her neck clicking softly against the edge of the table. With deliberate, highly visible movements, she reached her arm across the pristine white linen tablecloth, extending her open palm toward me. Her fingers were outstretched, waiting. She was publicly demanding the physical surrender of my independence. She expected me to reach into my expensive leather tote bag, pull out a set of shiny brass house keys, and place them submissively into her waiting hand, in front of the entire assembled audience. The expectation in the room was absolute, a crushing physical weight bearing down on my shoulders, demanding my immediate compliance. I sat perfectly still, observing the sheer arrogance of their assumption. I watched the fake tears tracking down Brittany's cheeks and the greedy glint in Patricia's eyes. I felt the collective gaze of my extended family pressing against my skin. I did not feel a single ounce of anxiety or fear. I felt only absolute clarity. The trap had been sprung exactly as anticipated, but my father had made a fatal miscalculation. He believed I was the prey. He had absolutely no idea that he had just walked willingly into my snare. The polite clapping slowly died down as the seconds ticked by, and I made no move to reach for my bag. The approving smiles around the mahogany table faltered, replaced by murmurs of confusion and impatience. Patricia's outstretched hand remained hovering, her fingers twitching with irritation, as she realized I was not complying with the script. She shot me a warning glare, a silent command to stop stalling and hand over the property. Brittany's fake tears dried up instantly, her expression hardening into petulant annoyance. Richard lowered his champagne flute, his triumphant smile slipping just a fraction as the silence stretched from dramatic to uncomfortably tense. He cleared his throat loudly, a clear signal that the performance was dragging and it was time for me to play my assigned role. I ignored his warning completely. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my expression neutral and unbothered. I did not reach for my tote bag or look for the keys they so desperately desired. Instead, I slowly pushed my chair back, the wooden legs gliding over the floor. I stood up, rising to my full height, smoothing the front of my tailored, charcoal gray suit jacket. I moved with slow, calculated precision. Every eye in the dining room was locked onto my movements, the tension humming dangerously in the quiet air. I reached out and picked up the heavy black leather binder resting face down next to my water glass. The weight of the undeniable financial evidence felt solid in my hands. I held the binder firmly, turning to directly face my father at the opposite end of the table. I looked past the confused faces of my uncles and ignored the rising panic radiating from Patricia and Brittany. I looked Richard dead in the eye, holding his cold, arrogant stare with a fierce, unwavering intensity. I drew a deep breath, letting the absolute certainty of my victory settle into my chest. "I think there has been a massive misunderstanding," I said, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity, cutting effortlessly across the delicate china, the gleaming silver, and the suffocating silence of the room. "I never agreed to house anyone. My home is not a rehabilitation center for financial fraud." The collective gasp that rippled around the mahogany table was audible, a sharp intake of breath from 24 relatives who had spent the entire week believing my father's carefully constructed narrative. Uncle David froze his wineglass, suspended halfway to his mouth, while Aunt Carol's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. The smug, victorious smiles vanished from Brittany and Kevin's faces as if they had been physically struck by a heavy blow. Directly across from me, Patricia's outstretched hand dropped to the table. Her maternal mask shattered into furious, unadulterated panic. Her eyes darted frantically, taking in the shocked expressions of our extended family. She slammed her hands flat against the pristine white linen tablecloth, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths as she desperately tried to regain control of the situation. "Michelle, sit down this instant and stop causing a scene," Patricia hissed, her voice vibrating with a desperate, commanding anger that was entirely at odds with her pearl-wearing country club persona. "You are embarrassing yourself and you are embarrassing this family. Hand over those keys right now and apologize to your sister before you ruin this beautiful evening for everyone, who traveled so far to be here." I did not even look at her. I completely ignored my mother's frantic demands, keeping my gaze steady and unbothered. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. Then, moving with measured precision, I unclasped the metal rings of the heavy black leather binder. The sharp click echoed loudly in the tense silence of the private dining room. I reached inside and retrieved the first stack of papers, the premium color copies, enclosed in clear presentation folders. With a smooth, practiced motion, I slid the thick stack of documents straight down the center of the long mahogany table. The glossy folders glided effortlessly over the white linen, coming to a halt directly in front of my stunned uncles and aunts. "Since we are sharing family news tonight," I said, my voice carrying the calm, clinical authority of a senior executive addressing a boardroom, "I thought everyone should know exactly why Brittany and Kevin are suddenly homeless. They were not just trying to save money for a down payment. They were formally evicted for 6 months of unpaid rent on their luxury downtown apartment. And they could not pay their rent because they deliberately blew their entire life savings on a luxury vacation to the Bahamas and a completely bankrupt multi-level marketing scam that Kevin swore would make them millionaires overnight." The reaction was instantaneous chaos. Uncle David dropped his napkin and lunged for the first clear folder, his eyes scanning the official court eviction notices and the highlighted bank statements showing massive international travel expenditures. Aunt Carol grabbed the second folder, her jaw dropping as she read the detailed breakdown of the fraudulent business investments. Whispers erupted across the dining room as the undeniable paper trail was passed rapidly from hand to hand. The relatives who had aggressively texted me insults about my selfishness were now staring at Brittany and Kevin in absolute horror. Cousins who had previously sent me hateful text messages were now pulling out their phones, snapping photos of the undeniable evidence. Brittany sank low into her high-backed chair, her pale pink silk dress suddenly looking foolish rather than innocent. She covered her face with her hands, no longer faking tears of gratitude, but hiding from the searing heat of public exposure. Kevin looked like a trapped animal, his chest deflating as his arrogant facade crumbled into dust. My father was standing, frozen, at the head of the table. The crystal champagne flute he had tapped so confidently just moments before was now shaking violently in his grip. His face had turned a mottled, dangerous shade of purple. He opened his mouth to speak, to launch into another charismatic lie, to spin the eviction notices into some kind of complex misunderstanding. But I refused to give him a single second of oxygen. I reached back into the black leather binder and pulled out the final, most devastating document. It was printed on thick, heavy paper, the official letterhead of the commercial bank clearly visible. I did not slide this document down the table to the aunts and uncles. I walked slowly toward the head of the table and placed it directly on the immaculate placemat sitting right in front of Grandma Beatrice. "But the real reason my parents are trying to force them into my home is this," I announced, ensuring every single person in the room heard every single syllable. Dad and Mom co-signed a $150,000 personal loan for Brittany's failed business venture. It is completely in default. The bank is threatening an asset lien on their house. They desperately needed me to provide free housing for Brittany and Kevin, so they could secretly seize Brittany's entire monthly paycheck to avoid their own personal bankruptcy. The silence that crashed down on the dining room this time was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It was the sound of a grand, generational illusion being shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The color entirely drained from Richard and Patricia's faces, leaving them looking like hollow, terrified ghosts. My father slowly lowered his champagne flute to the table, his hand trembling so badly that the crystal clinked loudly against the china plate. His broad shoulders slumped, the powerful, benevolent patriarch instantly replaced by a desperate, drowning man who had just been caught in the ultimate lie. Patricia pressed her hands against her mouth, a strangled sound escaping her throat as she realized their catastrophic financial failure was now public knowledge. They had tried to sacrifice me to save their empire, and in doing so, they had handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy them. At the head of the long mahogany table, Grandma Beatrice sat perfectly still. The formidable matriarch did not gasp, and she did not whisper. She reached into her tailored navy blue suit jacket with slow, deliberate precision. She retrieved her gold-rimmed reading glasses, unfolded the arms with a soft click, and placed them carefully onto her nose. She picked up the defaulted commercial loan document I had placed in front of her. The heavy paper rustled loudly in the dead quiet of the room. Her sharp, gray eyes scanned the bold numbers, the severe bank warnings, and the undeniable, legally binding signatures of her son and daughter-in-law. The entire room held its breath suspended in a state of paralyzing anticipation. No one dared to speak. No one dared to look away. I watched Beatrice's eyes move back and forth across the page, tracking the exact sum of the defaulted loan. $150,000, plus $50,000 in late fees and compounding interest penalties. I could practically see the formidable gears of her analytical mind turning, processing the raw data and calculating the brutal truth. I watched the exact second the realization hit her. Her eyes narrowed into tiny, dangerous slits. She looked up from the document, her gaze bypassing me entirely to lock directly onto her son. The room waited in terrified silence as the matriarch effortlessly connected the dots between this catastrophic defaulted loan and the urgent $200,000 business investment Richard had begged her to fund just 3 days prior. The realization washed over Grandma Beatrice, transforming her composed features into a mask of fury. I watched as her hands began to shake. It was a fine tremor born not of frailty, but of deeply rooted anger. She slowly lowered her reading glasses and let the heavy bank document drop from her fingers. The paper landed on her placemat with a soft thud that sounded louder than a gunshot in the silent dining room. Beatrice turned her head, her gray eyes narrowing into daggers as she locked her gaze on her son. The matriarch leaned forward, pressing her hands flat against the mahogany table. "A commercial real estate venture," Richard Beatrice asked, her voice dangerously low and vibrating with icy precision. "You sat in my sitting room, looked me directly in the eye, and asked for $200,000 of family money for a lucrative commercial real estate venture." She paused, letting the weight of his lie settle over the family. "You actually asked me to blindly cover a defaulted personal loan for your irresponsible daughter while orchestrating a ruthless campaign to hijack Michelle's home. You thought you could defraud your own mother to save yourself from bankruptcy." The magnitude of the public exposure hit my father like a physical blow. Richard stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing silently as he searched for a lifeline that did not exist. The charismatic patriarch was gone, replaced by a sweating, stammering coward. He raised his hands in a frantic gesture, his eyes darting around the room as he realized his siblings and cousins were watching his absolute destruction. "Mother, please," Richard stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure of her glare. "You have to listen to me. This is a complete fabrication. Michelle is lying to you. She has always been jealous of her sister. These documents are forged. She manufactured this ridiculous story to ruin this family dinner." It was a pathetic defense. A final, desperate attempt to cling to the grand illusion he had spent decades building. But Beatrice did not blink. She slowly tapped her index finger against the heavy paper resting on her placemat. The raised seals of the commercial bank caught the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. The undeniable signatures of both Richard and Patricia were printed clearly at the bottom of the page, notarized and legally binding. "Do not insult my intelligence," Richard Beatrice replied, her tone dripping with disgust. "These are official bank seals. These are your exact signatures. This is a legally binding notice of default, and you know it. You have been caught, and your pathetic attempts to blame your successful, independent daughter only highlight the staggering depth of your moral bankruptcy." Across the table, Patricia's maternal facade finally dissolved. The harsh reality of their total social and financial ruin crashed down upon her, shattering her polished country club poise. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving as she burst into loud, genuine tears. These were not the manipulative tears she had encouraged Brittany to cry just moments before. These were the desperate, terrified sobs of a woman who had just watched her luxury estate, her social standing, and her comfortable retirement vanish into thin air. Beside her, Brittany sat entirely paralyzed, finally understanding that there was no magical rescue coming. Kevin stared silently at his empty dessert plate. The extended family watched the spectacular collapse of my parents' false empire in stunned, horrified fascination. Uncle David slowly set his wineglass down, looking at his brother with an expression of profound revulsion. Aunt Carol leaned away from Patricia, distancing herself from the toxic financial fallout. The very people who had blindly supported my parents were now recalculating their allegiances, recognizing the undeniable truth sitting in the open black leather binder. Grandma Beatrice did not raise her voice. She did not need to yell to command absolute authority. Her quiet, unwavering presence was far more devastating than any screaming match could ever be. She stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her tailored navy blue suit jacket, projecting the unyielding power of a monarch, delivering a final, irrevocable sentence. "Richard, you have proven yourself completely unworthy of the trust this family has placed in you," Beatrice announced, ensuring her words carried clearly to every corner of the private dining room. "You have attempted to steal from the family trust, and you have attempted to maliciously destroy your own child to cover your gross financial incompetence. Therefore, I am making my decisions perfectly clear right here and right now." She looked directly at her son, her gray eyes devoid of maternal warmth. "Effective immediately, you are formally and permanently removed as the primary executor of the family trust. You will no longer have any access to or authority over a single penny of the generational wealth your father built." Richard let out a strangled gasp, his hands gripping the wooden back of his chair to keep himself from completely collapsing. Patricia's hysterical sobbing intensified, echoing loudly through the silent room. But Beatrice was not finished delivering her justice. Furthermore, Beatrice continued her steady voice, cutting effortlessly through Patricia's dramatic crying. "I am cutting off all financial support to you, to Patricia, and to Brittany. There will be no early disbursements. There will be no emergency loans. There will be no magical bailouts to save your luxury house from the bank. You created this catastrophic financial disaster with your own relentless greed and your own blinding arrogance, and you will face the brutal consequences entirely on your own. You are completely cut off." The execution was absolute and flawless. In minutes, my father had gone from expecting to forcefully seize my home to losing his financial safety net and his elevated position of power within the extended family. He had lost everything. He sank heavily into his chair, a broken, defeated man, staring blankly at the ruined remnants of his life. The profound shift in power was palpable. The tension that had gripped the mahogany table finally broke, replaced by a silent realization that Richard's manipulation was over. I sat perfectly still, observing the devastation, feeling a deep sense of peace. I had not merely defended my boundaries, I had completely dismantled their ability to threaten my independence again. Then, the matriarch turned her attention away from the wreckage of her son's life. Grandma Beatrice slowly turned and looked directly at me. The harsh anger that had twisted her features vanished entirely. As our eyes met across the table, her expression softened into a look of deep respect. It was the kind of genuine validation I had spent my childhood seeking, finally given freely and without toxic conditions. She reached out and gently placed her hand over the defaulted loan document, securing the undeniable evidence of my victory. Then she offered me a small smile that reached all the way to her observing gray eyes. "You have my sincerest apologies," Michelle Beatrice said, her voice warm and carrying a note of profound pride. "I am deeply sorry that you were subjected to this horrific manipulation. You stood your ground. You protected your hard-earned future, and you exposed a dangerous rot in this family that needed to be brought to light. You are the only person in this room who has demonstrated any real sense of unwavering integrity and true strength tonight." She paused, letting her words sink deeply into my heart. "Your grandfather would be incredibly proud of the fiercely independent woman you have become. I know that I certainly am." Beatrice's words hung in the quiet air. A final, definitive judgment that sealed my victory. She did not wait for a single response from my stunned parents. The matriarch simply pushed her heavy mahogany chair back, gave me one last approving nod, and walked out of the private dining room with her head held high. Her departure broke the heavy spell that had kept the extended family frozen in their seats. The suffocating silence shattered into a chaotic scramble of whispered arguments and chairs scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. Uncle David was the first person to move. He threw his white linen napkin onto his half-eaten expensive raspberry tart, grabbed Aunt Carol by the arm, and practically dragged her toward the double doors. He did not even look at my father. Aunt Carol kept her eyes glued to the patterned rug, absolutely terrified of being associated with the catastrophic financial fraud that had just been publicly exposed. My other relatives followed their panicked lead in a desperate herd. Uncles, aunts, and cousins, who had happily eaten expensive seared filet mignon on my father's tab, suddenly remembered urgent early morning meetings and babysitters who needed to be relieved immediately. They grabbed their expensive coats and fled the room, actively shunning the people they had praised just an hour ago. Within 5 minutes, the lavish private dining room was entirely empty except for the confused waitstaff clearing plates and the 4 antagonists sitting in humiliated defeat. I picked up my black leather binder, slid it calmly into my tote bag, and walked out without looking back, leaving them to pay the massive dinner bill alone. I stepped into the cool evening breeze, finally breathing freely for the first time. The real-world consequences of their malicious actions did not take long to fully materialize. Over the next month, the grand illusion my family had spent decades maintaining completely collapsed. Without the safety net of Grandma Beatrice's endless money, and without the free luxury housing they had aggressively tried to extort from me, Brittany and Kevin hit rock bottom. The eviction from their beautiful downtown apartment was legally finalized, and their bank accounts were entirely drained from their lavish Bahamas vacation and the completely bankrupt multi-level marketing scam. With absolutely no other options, they were forced to rent a cramped, severely rundown, truly tiny two-bedroom apartment in an industrial neighborhood they previously would have ruthlessly mocked. I heard the pathetic details through the relentless family grapevine. The walls of their new place were very paper-thin, carrying the constant noise of heavy traffic and loudly arguing neighbors. The carpets smelled faintly of old smoke, and the kitchen appliances were outdated and covered in rust. Brittany, who had spent her entire life being heavily pampered as the untouchable golden child, was completely unprepared for the harsh reality of minimum wage work and budgeting strictly for generic groceries. She could no longer spend her free afternoons shopping at exclusive high-end boutiques or posting highly curated photos of a fake luxurious lifestyle. Instead, she had to take a humiliating job as a front desk receptionist at a local dental clinic just to help make their monthly rent. Kevin's arrogant, inflated facade dissolved entirely. He was forced to accept a grueling, demanding, harsh entry-level cold-calling sales position, working impossibly long hours just to keep the basic electricity running in their tiny apartment. The crushing stress of their sudden, self-inflicted poverty quickly fractured their supposedly perfect marriage, replacing their smug confidence with bitter daily arguments over unpaid utility bills and entirely empty bank accounts. For Richard and Patricia, the financial destruction was even more profound and publicly devastating. The commercial bank did not care about their polished country club reputation or their carefully manicured social image in the suburbs. The bank wanted the $150,000 from the defaulted personal loan, plus the massive compounding interest penalties and late fees. With Beatrice formally cutting off all access to the lucrative family trust, my parents had absolutely no way to produce that kind of liquid cash. To avoid a devastating legal lien being placed on all their assets, they were forced into a humiliating financial liquidation. The twin luxury Mercedes sedans they loved to parade around the neighborhood were the very first things to go, unceremoniously replaced by a single, heavily used compact car that constantly needed repairs. But selling the expensive vehicles was not nearly enough to cover the massive debt they had foolishly co-signed for my younger sister. They had to list their sprawling, pristine, massive 5-bedroom luxury estate on the open market. The suburban neighborhood gossip mill worked with ruthless, terrifying efficiency. The bright real estate sign firmly planted on their perfectly manicured front lawn became a glowing beacon of their total financial ruin. Moving trucks arrived under the cover of darkness, hauling away decades of accumulated wealth as they downsized into a modest, aging townhouse on the completely opposite side of the county. Their elevated social standing vanished overnight. Patricia's wealthy country club friends stopped returning her phone calls entirely, and the club eventually revoked their membership due to months of unpaid dues. Richard's former business associates suddenly found themselves far too busy for a friendly round of golf or a casual lunch. They became absolute social pariahs, completely ostracized by the very community they had spent their entire lives trying to impress and dominate. Every bridge they had built was burned, leaving them isolated in a prison of their own making. The quiet evenings in their cramped new townhouse were filled with bitter silence, a constant reminder of the terrible choices they had made. There was absolutely no one left to manipulate, no one left to lie to, and no one left to fund their extravagant daily lifestyle. They had willingly sacrificed their integrity and actively attempted to destroy their own daughter just to maintain a fragile illusion of wealth. In the end, that incredible, blinding arrogance left them with absolutely nothing. The next morning, I woke in my master bedroom to sunlight stretching across the hardwood floor. For several seconds, I listened for the buzz of crisis that followed any attempt to resist my family. My phone was full of missed calls, voicemails, and messages from Richard, Patricia, Brittany, and Kevin. I did not reopen the argument. I did not give them another opportunity to revise what had happened at the country club or convert consequences into an emergency I was expected to solve. I deleted the voicemails without playing them. Then I blocked my parents, my sister, and my brother-in-law across every channel they had used to reach me: phone, email, social media, and messaging applications. I also blocked the relatives who had threatened my career or participated most aggressively in the smear campaign. I preserved the evidence folder, the police incident information, and the financial documents, but I removed the people themselves from my daily life. As each name disappeared from the screen, I waited for the guilt that had controlled me since childhood. It never arrived. What I felt was space. No command could enter my kitchen unless I allowed it. No manufactured emergency could cross my front door. No promise made by Richard or Patricia could create an obligation for me again. I carried my coffee to the repaired front window and looked over the lawn. The tire trenches were still visible, and the sprinkler system would need professional work, but the damage was limited and repairable. For the first time, I understood that the same was true of my life. Their behavior had left marks, but it had not taken ownership. The house remained mine, and so did the future inside it. Months passed peacefully, and the dramatic, chaotic ugliness of that evening at the country club faded into a distant, powerless memory. The story closes on a beautifully warm, golden summer evening. I was sitting comfortably on the expansive back patio of my stunning four-bedroom home, the very house my family had tried so ruthlessly to hijack. The late afternoon sun cast a rich amber glow across the perfectly manicured lawn, illuminating the vibrant flower beds I had carefully planted myself. A gentle cooling breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming jasmine through the warm air. The faint, rhythmic ticking of the irrigation system provided a soothing background melody. The sprinkler heads that Kevin had so carelessly crushed beneath the heavy tires of his rented moving truck had been fully repaired weeks ago. They were now humming quietly, casting perfect, glittering arcs of water over the vibrant green grass. Every single detail of the property was exactly as I had envisioned it when I first signed the closing papers. It was no longer a contested battleground or a financial prize to be fought over by greedy relatives. It was simply my home, an undeniable physical manifestation of my independence, my hard work, and my unwavering determination to build a beautiful life on my own terms. I was hosting a small, intimately curated dinner party to celebrate the changing season. The atmosphere was a world away from the tense, performative family dinners I had endured my entire life. My fiercely loyal friend Jasmine was sitting across from me at the rustic wooden patio table, her vibrant laughter ringing out freely as she poured us both generous glasses of chilled white wine. Jasmine had been the one to stand firmly by my side when the family gaslighting was at its absolute worst, constantly reminding me of my own reality when my parents aggressively tried to distort it. Seeing her relaxed and happy in my sanctuary felt like the ultimate victory over the people who had tried to isolate me. We shared amusing stories and joked about the daily challenges of our demanding careers, enjoying the simple, profound luxury of a peaceful evening without any hidden agendas or impending emotional ambushes. We toasted to the sheer joy of living an authentic life, celebrating the fact that I had chosen myself over the soul-crushing expectations of people who never truly loved me. The catered food was simple but delicious. The conversation was effortless and genuine, and the company was entirely supportive. There were no manipulative tears being shed, no extravagant financial lies being spun, and absolutely no arrogant demands being made for my hard-earned resources. Seated comfortably in a plush, thickly cushioned patio chair near the edge of the garden was Grandma Beatrice. She held a crystal glass of sparkling water infused with fresh lemon, observing our lively conversation with a serene, deeply contented smile. The formidable matriarch had become a regular and welcome guest at my home since that fateful night. Our relationship had beautifully blossomed into a deeply respectful bond built entirely on honesty, transparency, and mutual admiration, rather than toxic familial obligation. I looked affectionately at her then, out across the vibrant, perfectly watered lawn, and finally up at the sturdy brick walls of my beautiful house. This magnificent sanctuary was paid for entirely by my own sweat, secured by my own careful planning, and defended by my own brilliance against the very people who should have protected me. I leaned back into my wooden dining chair, inhaling the sweet, fragrant evening air as the sun finally dipped below the tree line. I took a deep, incredibly peaceful breath, letting the absolute certainty of my safety settle permanently into my bones. The generational cycle of manipulation and financial abuse was forever broken. The relentless anxiety that had plagued my childhood and early adulthood had been completely eradicated, replaced by an unbreakable core of quiet strength. Looking at the people gathered around my table, I realized that true family is not defined by bloodlines, but by mutual respect, shared joy, and truly unconditional loyalty. I raised my glass to the darkening sky, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the beautiful life I had fought to preserve. I knew with absolute, unwavering conviction that I would never be a human shield for anyone ever again.